I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In this podcast series, we'll explore how politicians use language to influence us. We'll look at the tricks and techniques they use, and we'll chat to some of the world's best-known scholars. In this episode, we take a look at the role of politicians as storytellers. We'll listen to some moving examples of political narrative in action, asking what it is that makes some stories resonate while others just sound strategic. And we'll be joined by Alan Finlayson, who is Professor of Political and Social Theory at the University of East Anglia, and recently led the Speech, Dramatising Rhetorical Citizenship research project.
His backbenchers say it's embarrassing, your words. Is everything okay, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister!
Well, Mr. Speaker, I tell you what's not working, it's that line of attack.
You turn if you want to. The lady's not for turning.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Humans are storytellers. We don't only have experiences, we tell experiences. We shape lived moments into coherent narratives, bringing them back to life in order to make sense of our lives. We produce personal stories, stories about others, stories about the us we think we are and the them we want to distance ourselves from. Politics can be defined as an argument about stories, their veracity, their significance, their relationship to one another, their consequences for who we are and what we do. Parliaments and congresses might be thought of as ongoing editorial meetings, endlessly arguing over how to tell a story and what's going to happen next. So, what exactly are stories? Well, typically, they're neither fabrications nor faithful reports of reality. The purpose of a story is to connect sequences of real events with a view to expressing their meaning. They are, in the famous phrase of the historian Hayden White, a function of the impulse to moralise reality. In other words, they're framing devices whereby we ascribe rightness and wrongness, significance and irrelevance, usness and themness to personal and collective experience. You can't rigorously analyse a story for its truthful meaning in the way that you scrutinise a scientific report for its evidential veracity. Stories are pragmatic endeavours to offer a convincing version of truth and reality. They stand or fall by their plausible resonance. There can be more than one compelling account of reality offered to us. Britain is a vibrantly prosperous nation. Britain is a declining, failing country. And we are invited to enter into the narrative thrust of whichever one seems most in line with our experience, our values, our hopes, and our fears.
Since mid-October, 10-year gilt rates have fallen, debt servicing costs are down, mortgage rates are lower, and inflation has peaked. The International Monetary Fund says our approach means the UK economy is on the right track.
Yeah. After 13 years of his government, our economy needed major surgery. But like millions across our country, this budget leaves us stuck in the waiting room with only a sticking plaster to hand. Yeah. A country set on a path of managed decline, falling behind our competitors, the sick man of Europe once again.
Yeah. Which of these chroniclers of political reality are you prepared to believe? Why one and not the other? What makes the best story compelling and the worst one simply unbelievable? I'm struck by how in recent years politicians have taken to telling very personal stories about their own most intimate experiences, about the personal travails and troubles of their constituents, about people they've encountered here and there, offline and online. Are you sitting comfortably? They're going to tell you a story.
A man came to see me on Monday. He'd been sanctioned, he had no money. He'd been called for an interview but wasn't able to go because he had to take his wife, a very seriously ill wife actually, to a hospital for cancer treatment. And he couldn't be 30 miles away at the same time, and he was sanctioned.
It is by a coincidence to the day, the 8th anniversary of receiving a phone call here in Westminster that my father had been found dead in his garage. As you can see, I don't find this easy to talk about even after 8 years. But I've done so before and I will do so today, not least because I know that he would have wanted me to, as somebody who had always believed in a change of the law in assisted dying. And he had always said that he would rather end things than face a degrading death. My father was somebody who'd made the most of his life. He had a tough East End upbringing in poverty. He became an RAF pilot in the war. He built a successful business career. He had a share of health problems, but he faced them all positively. He wasn't afraid of pain, but he couldn't face the indignity of a lingering death.
It starts slowly, a few emotional knocks, alternated with the romantic gushes and promises of everlasting love. So you are left reeling, confused, spinning around in an ever-changing but always hyper-alert state, not knowing what mood or message awaits you. But then it starts. In a strange city, his face changes in a way that you are starting to know and dread. In a way that tells you need to stay calm, silent and very careful. He goes for a walk. You sit in your hotel room and wait. You read a city guide and plan which sites you want to visit, mentally packing a day full of fun. But he seems to have another agenda. He doesn't want you to leave the room. He's paid a lot of money and you need to pay him your full attention. You're expected to do as you are told. You know for certain what that means, so you do exactly as you are told. And in the months that follow, those patterns continue. Reward, punishment, promises of happily ever after, alternated with abject rage, menace, silent treatment, and coercive control.
What's going on here? Has political discourse turned into one big therapy session? For a long time now, politicians have been criticised for being out of touch. And the more democratised our culture becomes, the more out-of-touchness is regarded as a problem. In democratic cultures, people want to know that the people who represent them know them. Politicians' stories are bids to be regarded as human, feeling, emotionally intelligent, just like us. Look, they shed tears when painful things happen to them. They empathise with the distress of others. They don't only know the figures, but they've got to know the human figures behind the figures. At its best, there's something cathartic about a story that evokes shared feelings. It makes us feel that, regardless of what we choose to do next, we are, for that moment, in the same moral space, encountering the same raw experience. And in this sense, the prevalence of stories in politics has a humanising effect. But, oh dear, politicians are incorrigible strategists. Give them an opportunity to display their humanity, and you can be sure that some of them will over-display it, milk it. And before they've had time to dry their eyes, they're accusing each other's display of being pure fabrication, performance and hypocrisy. In short, politicians know how to ruin a good story. by telling it in an unsubtly biased way, by exaggerating the parts that suit them, by making bits up, and by doing whatever they can to outperform rival storytellers. Managing the political narrative, or political spin, if you will, is now one of the great aims of politicians and parties. Every morning, and often more than once a day, they wrestle for control of the media agenda, ensuring that their stories are the ones that you and I are talking about. There is even a whole industry dedicated to burying stories, making sure that citizens and voters are disconnected from the stories that might take us off in disruptive directions. Politics is increasingly a battle not only for the best story, but for the Darwinian survival of those fragments of experience that the most powerful storytellers want us to remember. I like still to believe that the stories that resonate with people and have the most enduring effects possess a certain quality that exceeds the cunning of vulgar spin and fabrication. But there's plenty of evidence to cast doubt upon such optimism. Perhaps Alan Finlayson, who is Professor of Political and Social Theory at the University of East Anglia, can help us to get the story straight. Alan, politicians seem to constantly be telling me stories these days. Every time I listen to a political speech, they don't tell me about boring statistics anymore. They tell me about Jane from Grimsby and how fascinated they were by her life story. When did all of this start, and why do they do it?
That's a good question, and not an entirely easy question to answer, because at one level stories have had a place in political rhetoric since the invention of human speech. But it does seem to be the case that the volume and the number of these stories, of these anecdotes in mainstream political speeches began to increase in the 1980s and then really took off in the 1990s, particularly in the Blair years, and has stayed quite high ever since. So why did that happen? Well, there might be lots of reasons for it. One, I think, is simply that as more journalists became involved in speech writing, they brought with them certain journalistic techniques, such as the idea of the human interest story, or as pinning a complex story on some individual's experience of it to make it more relatable. And so that made its way into the political speeches. But I think it also went with a broader change in not just political culture, but culture generally, in which personal testimony and personal experience began to be seen as not just important and valuable, but in a way more privileged than expert insight. You saw that happening on, for example, TV talk shows in the 80s and 90s, where the expert doctor who could talk about how to treat some condition began to go back in the crowd and be replaced by the person who was suffering from the condition. So there's a deeper change in the culture there, which privileges personal experience in certain ways.
What works and what doesn't work when politicians tell stories? I mean, clearly sometimes they tell stories that go on, and my word, when they're funny, they're usually not funny. But what about the ones that do work? And I know you've written about at least one story that in quite a fundamental way didn't work.
Yeah, so I think you're thinking of the famous moment in the 2010 election debates when David Cameron tried to make a point by starting, "I met a 40-year-old black man in Portsmouth," which immediately got a laugh. Yeah. And certainly caught the attention of people like me, because the way in which he introduced the story, he was trying to make a point about immigration. He was trying to bring forward a story about someone he'd met who was in favour of immigration restrictions, and clearly wanted a story that would say the kinds of people who are in favour of immigration restrictions aren't just the kind of people you would expect. But the crudity of introducing it in such a specific way undermined the ability of the story to carry what David Cameron wanted to carry. So maybe what we can do is step back a bit and think, well, why didn't that work, and what kinds of things do we think these stories might do as forms of argument? Because I'm interested in political speeches not just as performances, though they are that, and as entertainment, so they can be that, but as ways in which political arguments are made and the ways in which people try to persuade each other to share their politics. So one purpose of a story might be to elicit emotions, to make something very vivid and powerful, maybe like the human interest story that we were just talking about, to get people to see this is what this situation is like for these people who are suffering from the cost of living crisis, for example, or these people who have been cancelled by the woke mob or whatever it might be. You bring forward some example that can make people feel, yes, that's bad. I feel angry about that. I feel sad about that. Or maybe I feel hopeful about what we might do to resolve that. So emotions is one thing the story might be there to do. The second thing, and this might seem odd at first, is that it might be there to make some sort of rational or logical point, because a story can also be a kind of example, an instance of reality, as it were, an example of the way things are or the way some particular thing is, from which we might be then induced to conclude something. So it might be that we produce a story or tell a situation and say, this is an example of a rule, of the way things should be, or of an ideal sort of person, or an ideal way to behave, something that we should emulate. Or it might be an example of saying, in the past, when we faced this situation, we raised taxes, cut taxes, we invested or whatever, and it worked then, so maybe it would work again. So in that case, a story is an illustration of some kind, helping to make a logical point. But a story could also be about the person telling the story. And that's in a couple of ways. It might be about the person telling the story in as much as the person is really telling you, oh, I met Ollie from Southampton, or I forget your example, June from Grimsby, whatever it might be. And it may be a way in which a politician is trying to tell you, rather crudely, I think, oh, I know what ordinary people think because I've met an ordinary person. Here's a story about it and how moved I was by what they told me. And that can also then be a way in which the storyteller tries to tell you, look, I've got knowledge and understanding. I know what it's like in Grimsby or Southampton or Leeds. And the trouble with that is that can make one feel quite left out, because if you're the sort of person being talked about in the story, and here's a politician talking about you in what is really kind of an objectifying, quite a haughty sort of way, can actually have the opposite effect of that intended. It makes the politician seem rather distant from reality and from so-called ordinary people. It's a version of what I call sometimes, I hope this isn't too obscure a reference, the Streets of London problem, after the famous Ralph McTell song, which is a very moral song about you might think you've got problems, but let me take you by the hand and I'll show you people who are worse off than you. Well, where are the people who are worse off in that song? The singer and the audience are talking to each other about some other people who are the ones who are really suffering. And that can happen in politician stories. I think it's one of the reasons that people often feel put off by politicians and feel that politicians are not in touch. The very thing they do to try and seem in touch, talking about us as objects in their stories, can make us feel distance from them.
I get it. What about the politician who, hearing all that you've just said, says, thanks very much, Professor, for telling me what I'm doing, but I've got an instinct. I know what it is that people like to hear, and that's why I'm a politician. I'm particularly good at that. Do you think they are particularly good at that?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, we could look at the data that says whether people trust politicians or like them or not. That might tell us whether they are or not. There's a very interesting finding from some colleagues at Southampton University who wrote a book comparing what people think makes a good politician today from what we can glean people thought made a good politician in the past by looking at the records of, say, mass observation and people's reports of election experiences in the past. And what they find is that people over time seem to have moved from thinking that a good politician is somebody who has competence and understands the issues to thinking that a good politician is someone who's normal and not weird, because they're looking for someone who's normal and not weird. And the problem is that people find politicians not normal and a bit weird. And that would suggest to me that the ways in which politicians try to make themselves feel on the same level as people are not working. It's one thing to be a good raconteur who can tell a good humorous story and make people feel ill at ease. And there are quite a few politicians who are good at that because they are naturally people who like to do public speaking and interact with people. That they can be quite good at that. But when it comes to integrating those stories into larger arguments, I think often we find that politicians are not so good at that, and that's partly because they're not so good at making larger arguments, because they have all sorts of reasons to try and avoid saying anything particularly clear or direct about what they think is going on and what they think should be done, and they're extremely fearful, understandably so, of offending some part of the audience. In contemporary culture, audiences are very fragmented and maybe want to hear and respond to different kinds of stories, just as a joke that one group finds hilarious, another group can find appalling and offensive. Politicians don't want to say the thing that might offend someone else, so they tend to say nothing, and then they fall back on attempts to show that I'm a very ordinary, nice person. But if anyone ever comes up to you at some social occasion, starts telling you, I don't lie, I'm very nice, you're immediately going to think, this is a weird person, I'm going to find someone else to talk to.
And if they tell me I'm an ordinary person, I'm not sure I'd be flattered.
Exactly.
Well, when I was a boy, I had a book called Our Island Story. It was all about the history of Britain. I wonder, Alan, whether there is a British story, and if there is a British story, I wonder who's best at telling it, the left or the right?
Well, my first instinct is to say that there are lots of British stories and also lots of Welsh, English, Scottish and Northern Irish stories, and lots of Yorkshire and Lancashire and Somerset and Kent stories as well. There's lots of different stories.
I think you're proving the point that the left aren't that good at telling the story.
Yeah. So, but of course, the question is there a big story? Well, yes, I think there potentially is, but what that is going to be different in different moments. The problem is perhaps not so much left or right, but is there a story you can tell that will be clearly and directly connected to action you want to make in the present, and what kind of action might that be? And it's not going to be easy to tell a story that the conclusion of which is, well, let's slightly change the public sector borrowing requirement, or let's put a percentage on VAT. It's easier to tell a dramatic story, on the one hand, of decline. There's definitely a story of decline. We were great and things have gone wrong. And it's easy to turn that into a story of some kind of crime, a theft, who took Britain's greatness and who needs to be punished for it. And you can get that sort of, I would call that not really a political story because it's a prosecutorial legal story. And then you want to prosecute whoever it is, the woke people, the cultural Marxists, the EU Europhiles, or conversely, the bankers and the Tories and the people who betrayed us. So that is a left wing as well as a right wing story. There is a story of some national greatness, great heroes, whether that's Queen Victoria and Lord Nelson or Churchill or whoever it might be. But again, just telling that story doesn't necessarily lead to an argument about, well, what should we do about our problems now? So I think it's the national story in question would be the one that says, okay, why are things not working out right now? Why have we got a cost of living crisis? Why are we not able to address some of our problems in public services? How did we get here? Where do we go? And that seems to me a story that parties are somewhat resistant to really tell. No one wants to say we made some terrible mistakes and terrible decisions, because that's going to make somebody look bad and some voters feel bad, and it's going to alienate some people. And that's where I think the problem lies. If the story we're talking about is one that says, here's what's happened over the last 40 years, here are the things that went right, here are the things that went wrong, and the things we need to change, you're going to annoy somebody. And in a context where politicians are worried that annoying someone means losing the votes that are going to keep you in the election, then they're not going to tell those stories well.
I want to ask you another story-related question, which is about what most of us think of as stories, novels, films, plays. My favourite one about a politician, there are quite a few that I could think of, including Trollope's Palliser novels, would be a play by Trevor Griffith called Bill Brand. It was a series. It was a series. I wonder whether you think that there are stories about politicians that give us an insight.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, there are lots of stories about, particularly America, stories about US presidents, but often those are stories about the president who's the great guy, the true spirit, the down-to-earth real American who's beset by the dark forces of the bureaucracy and the powers that be who won't let them do what they want to do, which is, of course, a story that has now, as it were, not become real, but become believed in and acted on by many people in American politics. So in that respect, sometimes these stories are not particularly ideal from my point of view. There are some stories that perhaps explore, I mean, if those are stories that are attempts to hold up an ideal or critique the way in which our politics takes place. There are some stories that might be more insightful. There's David Hare's play about Neil Kinnock, which I think tells an interesting story about the difficulties of trying to be not just a politician compromised by circumstances. I think it's more interesting that in retrospect, it's about a politician who comes from one era of politics, someone who learned how to do politics by speaking to large crowds of people, just by speaking to rooms full of trade unionists in South Wales, who's now trying to be a politician in a world where you don't do that anymore. You have to speak on the TV and you have to manage your words for a different kind of media. Well, there's that kind of story too. I quite like some of the sort of more comic moments, I suppose, that illustrate political speech. There's a nice moment in Hitchcock's original 39 Steps in which the hero, Richard Hannay, on the run from the bad guys, stumbles into a political meeting and gets mistaken for the candidate and has to make up a speech on the hoof and delivers a series of cliches that get people going very wildly. There's also a very fun and interesting Frank Capra movie called Meet John Doe. It's not one of his more famous ones, but it's from 1942, a wartime film in which a journalist invents the story of a John Doe, an everyman, to write a dramatic column, and then ends up having to invent the person for real and find someone to play him, and inadvertently creates a mass political movement through the power of someone's words. And maybe a slightly more obscure reference, not a story, I suppose, but there's a forgotten comedian called Oliver Wakefield, who was quite big in the 1930s and 40s, who called himself the voice of inexperience and delivered comic monologues, not quite political monologues, but sometimes they imitate the sorts of homilies that you might get from authority figures, including politicians, but then completely disrupts and messes them up by forgetting his words and making strange leaps for homophones and puns. If people look up Oliver Wakefield keeping a stiff upper, they'll get a picture for him. I think they're quite a funny representation of public speech.
The absence of war.
That's the one, yes.
Alan, I knew this was going to be a really interesting interview, and I guess for me the takeaway is that there are good stories and there are bad stories, and there are also really important reasons for questioning why in the first place someone thinks that telling you a story when they've never met you before is going to work at all. And I think you've really put a lot of that into perspective for us, so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Stephen.
His backbenchers say it's embarrassing, your words. Is everything okay, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister!
Well, Mr. Speaker, I tell you what's not working. It's that line of attack.
You turn if you want to. The lady's not for turning.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.